You arrive home after an ordinary day. Nothing extraordinary happened. Maybe you worked a little. Maybe you solved a few things. Maybe the day was even relatively calm. And still, there is a strange tiredness. It's not just fatigue. It's a feeling of light tension that remains there, as if the body were tired, but at the same time still ready for something. You sit down on the couch. You try to relax. But you notice that relaxation doesn't really happen. Your shoulders remain slightly contracted. Your breathing never fully deepens. There is a small restlessness somewhere in the background of the body. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that looks exactly like anxiety. But it's not rest either. Maybe you know this feeling well. That moment when there are finally no more urgent tasks. No immediate problem to solve. No crisis happening. And still, the body does not slow down. It remains in a state of light readiness, as if something inside you were still waiting for a signal. For a long time, many people interpret this in a very specific way. They think they have difficulty relaxing. They think they are tense by nature. They think they need to learn some technique in order to finally slow down. But there is a possibility that is rarely considered. What if the problem is not that you can't relax, but that your nervous system never learned what it feels like to truly relax? Because for some people, the state of alert was not just a momentary reaction. It was an environment. Something present for years, sometimes since very early in life. Growing up in unpredictable environments. Environments where it was important to notice changes quickly. Environments where anticipating problems helped avoid conflict. Environments where being attentive meant protection. When that happens, the nervous system learns something very specific. It learns that vigilance is necessary. It learns that relaxing completely may be risky, not as a conscious thought, but as a pattern deeply embedded in the body. Imagine an alarm that has been configured to detect any small variation, a door opening, an unexpected noise, a change in the environment. At first, this alarm has an important function. It protects. It keeps the system prepared. But over time, if that alarm is never fully disarmed, it becomes the default mode of operation, even when the environment no longer requires it. The body remains attentive, observing, monitoring, looking for signals. And then something curious happens. The organism begins to confuse this state with normality. The light tension becomes familiar. Constant readiness begins to feel like just the way you are. And when a moment of rest finally arrives, the body does not quite know what to do. Because relaxing is not simply stopping movement. Relaxing is an internal state, a state in which the system recognizes that it can let go, that it no longer needs to monitor, that it no longer needs to anticipate. But if that state has never been deeply experienced, the organism continues operating in the only mode it knows. Light alertness, quiet readiness. That is why some people say something curious. They say they don't really know how to relax, even when they try, even when they want to, even when there is nothing threatening happening. The body remains slightly on, like an engine that has never been completely turned off. And this raises an important question. If the nervous system spent so long learning to remain attentive, how would it ever recognize that it can finally slow down? There is something silent happening inside the organism that is almost never directly noticed. A kind of internal regulator, a system that observes the environment all the time and decides what state the body should remain in. It does not ask the conscious mind what to do. It simply evaluates signals, facial expressions, tones of voice, movements around you, subtle changes in the environment, even internal sensations. This system functions like a continuous detector of safety or of possible threat. And when it perceives safety, the body naturally slows down. Breathing deepens, muscles relax, the internal rhythm decreases. But when this system perceives uncertainty, even if it is only a small uncertainty, it keeps the organism in a state of readiness. It is not fight. It is not flight. It is something more subtle, a light vigilance, a state in which the body remains prepared. And for some people, this state becomes so common that it stops looking like a state. It begins to look like personality. I'm just like this. I'm always on. I can never switch off. But what seems like a personality trait is often just a nervous system that spent a long time functioning in alert mode. The body learns through repetition. If for years it was necessary to anticipate problems, notice changes, pay constant attention to the environment, the system absorbs that pattern. It begins to operate as if vigilance were always necessary, even when the context has already changed. Think of a guard who spent his whole life watching a gate. Every day he observes who enters, who leaves, every small movement. Now imagine that one day there is nothing left to guard. The gate is closed. The environment is safe, but the guard is still there, walking back and forth. The habit of watching continues. The human body functions in a similar way. If it learned that it must constantly monitor, it keeps monitoring, even when there is no longer any danger. This creates a very particular sensation. You may be sitting in a comfortable place. You may be at home. You may be lying down. And yet there is still a small tension, an almost imperceptible readiness, as if some part of the system were waiting for something. Maybe you have noticed this. Breathing that never seems fully deep, shoulders that remain slightly raised, a light energy that never fully dissolves. Nothing that seems severe, but enough to prevent complete relaxation. At this point, many people try to solve the problem in the most logical way possible. They try to force relaxation, to breathe more slowly, to control their thoughts, to convince themselves that everything is fine. But the nervous system does not respond only to logic. It responds to experience, to real signals of safety. And if the organism spent a long time learning that the world requires vigilance, it is not enough to simply decide to relax. The system needs to recognize something it rarely had the chance to fully feel, the sensation that there is nothing to monitor, nothing to anticipate, nothing to control. And when that recognition does not happen completely, the body continues operating in the mode it knows, light alertness, quiet readiness, even when the conscious mind would like to rest. And this raises another even more intriguing question. If the body learned to remain attentive for so long, what really happens when it finally encounters a moment of real safety? There is a curious moment when many people begin to notice something different about their own experience. They spend years believing the problem is their inability to relax, that they lack discipline, that they lack control, that some personal flaw is involved. But when they start observing the body more closely, another possibility appears. Maybe the body is not resisting relaxation. Maybe it is simply doing exactly what it learned to do, remain alert. This completely changes the perspective, because when something is deeply learned by the nervous system, it stops being a conscious choice. It becomes automatic, like driving a car after many years. At first, every movement requires attention, but over time, the body does everything by itself. The same thing happens with internal states. If for a long time it was necessary to anticipate problems, monitor environments, solve things quickly, the nervous system begins to assume that this is the normal state, the baseline state, and when that state becomes the default, relaxing can feel strange, not because the body doesn't want to relax, but because that territory is unfamiliar. Imagine someone who spent years living near a noisy road. At first, the sound of cars seems impossible to ignore, but over time, the brain gets used to it. The noise stops being noticed. It becomes background. Now imagine that this person moves to a completely silent place. At first, the silence feels strange, even uncomfortable. Something seems out of place. The system looks for the noise that was always there. Something similar can happen with the state of alertness, when the body spends a long time accustomed to vigilance. Deep relaxation can feel unfamiliar, almost as if something were missing. This explains why some people report a curious sensation when they try to rest. They lie down. The environment is calm, but some part of the body remains active. The muscles do not fully release. Breathing does not deepen. There is a light energy circulating. It is not intense anxiety. It is simply readiness, like an engine that continues running in idle. This does not mean the body is broken. In fact, it means it learned very well how to protect itself. It learned to remain prepared. The problem is not in that learning. The problem appears when this mode continues active, even when it is no longer necessary, when the system keeps operating as if something needs to be monitored, even in safe environments. And when this state of silent vigilance remains for a long time, the body begins to carry that effort, sometimes as constant tension, deep tiredness, or difficulty fully resting. And perhaps this is where understanding begins to change. Because when you understand that the body is not sabotaging rest, something in your relationship with it shifts. Relaxation stops being a task. It stops being something that must be forced. It becomes something that can emerge when the system begins to perceive safety. And safety, for the body, is not an idea. It is an experience, something the organism feels, something it recognizes through subtle signals. The environment, the breath, the rhythm of the body, the absence of threat. When those signals begin to appear repeatedly, the nervous system can begin to learn something new, that it is not always necessary to remain alert, that another mode is possible, a mode in which the body can simply exist, without anticipating, without monitoring, without constant vigilance. But this raises a quiet question. If the nervous system spent so long learning to remain attentive, how does it begin to learn that now it can relax? Perhaps the most important shift does not begin by trying to make the body relax. Perhaps it begins by understanding why it stayed tense for so long. For years, many people treat this constant tension as a defect, as if something inside them were functioning incorrectly, as if relaxing were simply a skill they never developed properly. But when you observe the history of the nervous system itself, something different appears. The body did not become alert by accident. It became alert because it worked at some point, because paying attention avoided problems, because anticipating helped deal with difficult situations, because remaining prepared brought some form of protection. The nervous system learns through experience. It records patterns, and when a pattern helps maintain stability or safety, it tends to repeat it, even when the context changes. That is why, for some people, the state of alert became the default mode of functioning, not because the world is still threatening, but because the organism still operates based on an old learning. This learning is recorded deeply, not only in the mind, but in the body, in breathing, in the internal rhythm, in the way muscles organize themselves, in the way attention moves through the environment. And when you understand this, something curious happens. The tension stops looking like an enemy. It begins to look like an old strategy, a strategy the system used for a long time to guarantee stability. This does not mean the body needs to keep functioning this way forever, but it does mean that perhaps it never received enough signals that it can now slow down. The organism learns through repetition, through experiences that gradually show that the environment has changed, that it is no longer necessary to maintain the same vigilance, that there is space for another rhythm, a slower rhythm, deeper, quieter. And when the system begins to perceive those signals of safety repeatedly, something gradual can happen. Vigilance begins to decrease. Breathing finds more space. Muscles release a little more. Not immediately, not like a switch, but like a process, a silent relearning. Maybe that is why it is important to change the way you interpret this difficulty in relaxing. Maybe the problem was never inability. Maybe it was learning, a system that spent so long functioning in alert that it forgot what it is like to live in another state. But the human body is adaptable. It learns constantly, and when new experiences of safety appear, the system begins to reorganize its patterns, little by little, almost imperceptibly. Maybe the real question was never, why can't I relax? Maybe it is another. If your nervous system spent years learning to remain attentive, what happens when it finally begins to discover that it no longer needs to?